My name is Mikhail Zvenchuk. I am the founder of the Russian analytical center Rybar. Today we begin a series of investigations. We will tell you how the global system, a conglomerate of political, economic and social forces, has declared a real war on Russia. Modern warfare is not what humanity is used to. Yes, soldiers, tanks, missiles, airplanes and drones are all undoubtedly important. But the main theater of war is not on land, not on water, and not in the sky. It is in the information space, in the minds and souls of ordinary people. The winner is not the one with the largest and most formidable army. The winner is the one who knows how to fight in the fourth dimension, the one who can conquer and subdue the human mind.
They entered the territory of the dying Soviet Union and finished it off without a single shot, but that was only an intermediate task. The main goal that the system is still pursuing is the destruction of our country as a super idea, turning Russia into a sales market, a raw material appendage, controlled lands, the destruction of the center of thought and faith. We will have 9 episodes to assess what the system has achieved, what our opponents have accomplished, and where the scythe hit the stone. We will work with financial documents, we will interview witnesses, we will conduct a full investigation to find out what our opponents managed to do across the entire post-Soviet space and what it led to, because this is important primarily for us. We live here, our children will grow up here, and if we do not preserve ourselves as a community of people united by common values and traditions, we will simply disappear from the world map. The late 1980s. The first seeds of the system are already beginning to sprout in the post-Soviet space. Yes, the Soviet Union is still alive, it is still lingering, but the sprouts have already appeared.
A network of small non-governmental organizations, each of which is formally responsible only for its own small but important area of work, an area of kindness and warmth, care and selfless help, protection of children, women's rights, school education, support for small and medium-sized businesses or people with disabilities, development of independent media and national culture, assistance to animals and all the destitute.
Their task was what? To participate, of course, in the formation, yes, of such a new political core, yes, and political reforms. Agents of Leoniev, of course, were created by inviting people to various educational programs in American universities. There is even a separate program at Yale University, at Harvard University. Then there is the work of organizations like USAID, such as International Development, Agency for International Development. But the work is conducted clearly in specific directions. Such good slogans like, "We are for the rule of law, there should be rule of law everywhere." Well, only if it benefits us, of course.
Western governments, primarily the United States, initially do not spend very much money. They take cities and countries without a fight, exchanging sovereignty for food, humanitarian aid, books and textbooks, second-hand clothing, small scholarships for scientists and talented students. Foreign intelligence warns the Soviet leadership, prepare for a full-scale attack. The socialist camp has practically fallen, we are next. But in the Central Committee of the party, it's as if they neither see nor hear the obvious.
At that time, I headed the Department for Work, the Department of Socialist Countries in the Analytical Management. And the task was to prepare a report on the situation in the socialist countries. The conclusion was clear: the end, the end. Everything will collapse, nothing can be held back. Leonid Vladimirovich Shabarshin, the head of intelligence, read it and said, "Well, what can we do? We will report." What else? He says, "I just ask you, tell me, insert a couple of quotes from Karl Marx and Lenin. I'm serious. This is not a joke. This is reality. Insert them. He won't read it."
Meanwhile, dozens and hundreds of small NGOs using swarm tactics are already working towards a common goal, which ordinary participants often do not know about. The process of creating the most comfortable conditions for the entry of Western businesses, media, and public structures is underway.
They work everywhere, in all directions. You'd think, what do we have to do there, the English or the Americans? But they are there. It's not necessarily that a staff member is sitting in some kind of a Moor Tiger Lovers Fund, right? Well, or I Love Hair Foundation. He is connected with the intelligence community, and the intelligence community knows, and the intelligence community funds, if not directly, then through well-known foundations, right?
Funds of deep organizations.
As a side result, even before the actual collapse of the country, in many regions there is a total discrediting of local authorities. This trend will continue after the dissolution of the Union. National governments will become puppet regimes, capable only of retransmitting the will of their masters and performing circus acts. 35 years have passed. This is how it looks today. This is modern Moldova taking to the streets to oppose the banned LGBT ideology imposed on the country by its promising European leader, Maia Sandu.
Many are interested in whether Moldova is under external control. You know how? If carefully, then I definitely wasn't holding a candle. Today, strangely enough, the Moldovan authorities completely discredit those European values they talk about and declare, or, if you will, promote.
After the actors of the system completely destroyed the Soviet Union and it ceased to exist, one large piece remained, the core of that very union and former empire, which they wanted to dismember even further. To this end, they began creating various separatist movements in Chechnya and started rewriting history. They continued all this by giving freedom to diasporas and began supporting various movements across the country and in the former remnants of the Soviet Union for so-called decolonization. This is a trendy term that will be recalled with the start of the special military operation and will be repeatedly mentioned as something necessary to defeat the imperial regime and generally give Russia freedom. Freedom in their understanding, with values imposed by the West, with their approaches to raising children, and with their approaches to life, which are very foreign to us. Relying on the testimonies of eyewitnesses, historians, intelligence officers, and all those who experienced these undoubtedly tragic events for our country, we will reconstruct the full chronology of what exactly happened and what the system tried to do with the Russian Federation. Yes, and not only with the Russian Federation, but with all the post-Soviet republics that got caught in the web and where the seeds of this very system took root. What was it aiming for? What did the actors of this very system want? They wanted to eliminate a powerful geopolitical adversary with the guarantee that it could never be revived, that its army and population would simply be destroyed. They wanted to create new, practically bottomless markets.
Realizing that the process has become irreversible, America is in a great hurry. Even before the official announcement of the dissolution of the USSR, which Gorbachev would often recall later, US Secretary of State James Baker flew to Moscow with a load of humanitarian aid and held a meeting with the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Kozyrev, about the recognition of independent states, the Russian Federation, the so-called Ukraine, and Belarus.
When leading Soviet specialists who were granted the right to go abroad, well, for example, diplomats or some scientific exchanges, right? Or, as a rule, rather high-ranking people in the Communist Party would go abroad and be told, well, look, you are a smart, educated person. You have a high position in the Soviet Union, but what do you have?
Russia has no national interests, only universal human interests. These words are attributed to the then Russian Foreign Minister Kozyrev. Upon hearing them, former US President Nixon, to whom the remark was addressed, just shook his head, a position unthinkable for American politicians, but undoubtedly very convenient for America. Most of all, by the way, the Americans were surprised that the government of independent Russia, represented by the same Kozyrev, did everything to accelerate and make irreversible the process of transferring the Kuril Islands to Japan.
One of the country's leaders essentially prioritized foreign interests on the territory and at the expense of implementing, let's say, future options for our country. In other words, this person is, frankly speaking, worse than a traitor. This person essentially had the opportunity, and not just had the opportunity, he was implementing the interests of our country through leading the diplomatic department. And initially he assumed that Russia could not have its own, but why can't they have them?
But he's not the first one like that. Remember Shevardnadze, right? Do you remember what Shevardnadze was proud of? That when the borders were being clarified and the maritime boundaries between the United States and the Soviet Union were being demarcated, he did everything to ensure that the most advantageous fishing areas and shelf areas went to the United States.
Against this backdrop, it is much easier for the West to expand.
The same Baker, like other influential Western emissaries, would later make several visits that only on paper did not have the status of state visits, but in essence were meetings with formal and informal leaders of future independent countries. And each received sincere assurances: the West will always support you in everything. The only thing the emissaries of the system were concerned about at that time was nuclear weapons. They needed to be concentrated in one place, promising anything in return. Specific preparatory work for the redivision of the world has been underway for at least 10 years by this point. The Union, of course, is teetering on its own, and Western partners are doing their utmost to help it fall.
The time has come to get acquainted with one of the main figures. George Soros, philanthropist billionaire, a man who built an entire financial system that became the progenitor of the very system we are talking about today. His red jacket, white-toothed smile, all this charmed the Soviet people and created a false image of a person who could take care of absolutely everything and make the different parts of that very mechanism work, that hydra which enveloped the disintegrated Soviet Union. Back in the 1990s, a lot of money was invested in propaganda to show the difference in approaches and images. Here is what one of the most popular Soviet newspapers, Arguments and Facts, wrote about Soros in 1990.
It is difficult to associate the image and activities of George Soros with our traditional notions of the sharks of imperialism, cynically trampling spiritual values, legal norms, and morality in the pursuit of profit.
Once again, Arguments and Facts wrote about this in 1990 to show how a not very young guy in a crimson jacket with a white-toothed smile looks like a model of sanctity and worldliness.
People came, everything fell apart. People came who said, friends, we are giving you money, wonderful. Under what conditions? Well, under what conditions? You are entering, the Western world, which means democratic, liberal democratic values, and therefore Western civilization and all that. So you are our partners, right? Partners. We want to help you recreate a normal, non-totalitarian, not the cursed Soviet, not this imperial, but a normal education system. Do you need money? Yes. And on what terms? Well, so basically on no conditions. Take it. So, well, people took it, and who wouldn't?
Another important block is environmental initiatives. Under the guise of caring for the environment, Western researchers gain almost unrestricted access to all corners of the country. The collected data forms the basis for projects that will later restructure the extraction industry in the republics of the former Union and in Russia itself.
This is also part of the global plan. According to the West's idea, there was supposed to be just one big pipeline, a pump and a pipeline. The Soviet extraction industry is outdated and needs modernization, and of course only the West knows how best to do this. In the book by American geopolitician and political strategist Peter Zeihan, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, it is stated openly, the extractive industry of the Soviet Union was restructured by Westerners in such a way as to deprive it of the ability to operate without Western equipment and technologies. This was fully implemented. Moreover, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan today are not capable of independently developing their resources at all. Similarly, the West helped to raise and develop agriculture by introducing its agricultural genetics through a system of grants, both in animal husbandry and crop production. A new player is on our board, the agency USAID. This name has already become proverbial among these Western NGOs that are spreading chaos across the global space. Thanks to USAID, billions of dollars were poured into our country to build the so-called proper civil society. The USAID agency was attempted to be closed several times due to apparent inefficiency. They say they spend huge amounts of money, but where is the result? The money was there, undoubtedly. But even attempts by previous presidents to close the agency led to nothing, simply because the agency was not subordinate to either the presidents or the US government. This was an organ of global governance and global interference in the internal affairs of other states. In 1994, a tranche of $10.8 billion was approved for the creation in Russia, just think about it, of central financial management bodies. No one was able to destroy the agency. If you take a ride in a time machine to the year 2025 and try to understand why the agency even formally was able to be abolished by Trump and Musk, the answer will surprise no one. USAID managed processes, creating hotspots of tension here and there. Demiurges in boring suits managed the chaos, in which only they could discern numbers, graphs, growth, and development plans. Today, the need for this tool has simply disappeared because they completed their task, and young specialists in wrinkled t-shirts, managing global networks of new media, have taken their place.
Firstly, this is about, let's say, strengthening financial control, because unlike before, the United States cannot afford to waste money and stricter control systems are necessary.
What are the funds allocated for? Stricter reporting systems. This can only be achieved by fully subordinating these systems and processes to the state apparatus.
The second point, which is quite important, is the complication of tracking financial flows. Because as soon as we transfer anything as much as possible to there in the State Department, our secrecy classifications change, and it becomes much more difficult in the public domain to identify financial flows, who they go to, how they are distributed, and how they proceed.
Thirdly, it's diversification, because, let's say, fragmentation of networks and more complications.
And what, again, allows America to largely have free rein in its activities to undermine stable regimes in various countries. And another very important point, for some reason when talking about USAID, we completely forget about the National Endowment for Democracy, which has not gone anywhere.
The pace of the 90s, which seemed completely cosmic at the time, required gathering large armies of supporters and throwing them into endless mental assaults and sometimes onto quite tangible barricades. The working scheme was distinguished by its simplicity and effectiveness. First, you recruit the top and those who can support it in the coming years. Then you move lower and lower, and if the upper level is bought literally with money or by promising bright prospects, then with the lower levels they work more roughly, using effective methods of creating the image of an enemy.
Even among those people whom we now know as actors in Ukrainian politics, most of them were, as they say, recruited without any cuts.
When the United States begins within its agenda to gain control over a region or country, to finance and support nationalist movements of radical nationalists, nothing good awaits that region. Because we know what people who are radicalized are like.
From the outside, it seemed that in the competitions conducted by USAID to select operators for the former Union, completely unrelated structures were winning, which had previously serviced contracts in Rwanda, Guatemala, or Uganda. Formally, they had not the slightest idea of how they would operate in the new territory. But this is undoubtedly an erroneous assessment. After all, the winners knew how the system worked, regardless of the point on the map. And then the simple task is to gather all the current and future elite under their banner, connect them through informal communication, and only then start changing the landscape to suit themselves.
The authorities cannot stop this process because they are interested in development, in investments. Well, how is it usually said? In the development of economic and cultural relations. How? And you will ban the Society of Tajik tea lovers? How? Well, the English, they are tea specialists. They created this society. The elite, so to speak, of Tajikistan gathers there for tea.
How will you ban them? The work is ongoing.
The first time in 1992, I went into the office of Liudeyskaya Ferma on Pushkinskaya. I asked, how are things? Oh, you know, it's a very interesting time because laws are being created no more. Right now we are all working. We all, meaning the West, American lawyers plus American specialists who were sent here from the State Department, SUV, we are creating new Russian laws. The Constitution, the Civil Code, yes, that is the main laws, the Criminal Code. It's a very interesting time.
One of the most effective tools for the collapse of any empire has long been considered the tactic of instilling a simple truth. A certain group or nation dominates others, depriving them of cultural, political, economic, and religious agency. This method was applied in the USSR and later developed and continues to develop to this day in the independent states that emerged in the place of the collapsed country. Hatred towards a neighbor is an excellent way to build a political nation from scratch.
Why do you think, for example, in Kazakhstan or in some other republic, they sing the anthem in a regular high school? Children from low-income families, children of oligarchs, children of Kazakhstani officials sing with the same heartfelt inclusion and with such genuine, perhaps, I don't want to use this word, well, as if it might seem like patriotism.
Why?
Here we observe this, and there it exists, and only because they sing their anthem in hatred towards Russia. In the clinic, there is a huge poster, a whole stand is made, and posters with photographs of how Russians destroyed Kazakhs. Here, during the period from the revolution to the end of the Soviet regime.
Even before the start of perestroika, centers for the study of language and culture appeared and began to actively develop in the national republics on their own. In the so-called Ukraine, the forced Ukrainization of Russians began here after the revolution of 1917 and continues to this day. In the 80s, circles, organizations, and centers promoting the narrative Ukraine is not Russia emerged. In the 90s, this movement reached its peak.
In my first year in Donetsk, Bandera's grandson came and held meetings with us. All teaching about Orest Subtelny. This is at the university in the history department. This is the person who wrote the history of Ukraine in the 1960s, a Canadian from the diaspora. At the same time, the work Ukraine is not Russia is being written. I personally know the one who wrote it.
I don't know why it was written for those very Americans.
Everyone remembers Kuchma's book, Ukraine is not Russia. And I always insist that, in fact, Kuchma wrote another book a couple of years before that. and it is called About the Most Important. And in this very book, damn, I should have taken it, it is written that Ukraine should be a bridge between Europe and Russia. That is its destiny. It should take advantage of this unique opportunity. And we cannot and should not break our familial ties, because if we break them, it will immediately lead to, I won't elaborate further, simply put, it will lead to what it has all led to now. After this book was published, believe it or not, the cassette scandal happened. Some major recorded everything happening in the president's office for dozens of hours and days on a cassette recorder. And then when this scandal erupted, the Minister of Internal Affairs committed suicide with 2 shots to the head.
The same work is being carried out in parallel in the republics and later in the countries of the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Investments in national projects, creation and support of nationalist organizations, centers for teaching national languages and developing national culture, formation of national myths. The most striking example, apart from the so-called Ukraine, which built an entire cult around tragic events, is the Holodomor in Kazakhstan.
The matrix works approximately like this. Kazakhstan and Ukraine have roughly the same fate. There was a famine, yes, in the 1930s, both in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a victim of Russian colonial policy, both during the Tsarist and Soviet times. Just as Russia attacked Ukraine, it can...
Attacks on Kazakhstan. That's how it works there.
These methods were used by the intelligence services of the Third Reich. Now the Americans have adopted them, quickly systematizing and even scientifically justifying each thesis. With Soros's money, documentary films are made, museums are opened, and online resources are created.
After all, working with agents, in the broad sense with agents, is very rarely done in such a way that you, like we're sitting in a dark office as we are now, and you tell me, Roman, here are instructions with 16 points, do it like this, like that. Your position is now such and such. And this, with a rather narrow circle in extremely specific, let's say, candid situations. Most often, if you need to do something, you find people who already have the opinion you need to convey and simply help them express it. Yes, you look at those who are there, who want to protest, who want to denounce, who want to, I don't know, do something, and you help them a little to get there. And thus, a somewhat pyramidal system is formed through which many people pass. They are on different levels. Some are just sympathizers. Some just think that, well, you know, Western countries are like nothing. Well, they are our friends. There you made some club for independent journalists. You taught them all the rules of work. Independent press, search there in 60, there in 666 sources. So definitely all of that. If you don't criticize, then you're, well, bad and so on. But where will this journalist work? Well, obviously he won't work in the state of Colorado. He will work in the country where you taught him. And if he tries to go somewhere in the state of Colorado, then, so to speak, he'll quickly be put in his place.
Through so-called independent media, myths are being implanted into public consciousness, for example, about the forced Russification of Ukrainian education. And this is at a time when almost 70% of Ukrainian schoolchildren, according to Soviet statistics, spoke the language fluently. The same goes for education in the former Soviet republics. Meanwhile, facts were carefully obscured. Before the arrival of Soviet power, many peoples of the USSR did not have a written language at all, and the literacy statistics are shocking. In the Caucasus, more than 80%, and in Central Asia, more than 90% of the population could neither write, read, nor count, except for basic counting at the market.
But here comes a new generation. They come to school, open a textbook, a history textbook, and in black and white it says, for example, that in the Middle Ages you had a great nation, you are the heirs of Genghis Khan, you are the heirs of Tamerlane, you are the heirs of a great culture. And where did this culture go? And then the evil Russians came, enslaved you, and accordingly started to oppress you, deprive you of everything, take away your traditions, and strip you of your resources.
And critically, who will that be? I mean, who will criticize? Where can you get a critical perspective? No, why? Because this is structured at the level of, well, ministries, departments like the Ministry of Education of each republic.
Ukrainian politicians do not like it when someone reads open sources scientific research by Ukrainian authors, and they are ruthless to all those narratives that have been promoted in the independent country for almost 40 years. In the so-called Ukraine, there has long been a popular fake story about students from Lviv or Kharkiv who allegedly refused to take exams in Russian in the early 1950s, for which they were immediately repressed or even executed. Despite the fact that the fake made its way into textbooks and scientific articles, even the security service of Ukraine had to acknowledge its falsehood. But why do we need all these internal disputes among supporters of the Kiev regime when there are statistics? So, in 1954, 73% of school children in the Ukrainian SSR were studying in the Ukrainian language. Where would repression against the Ukrainian language come from? Yes, certainly repression is not a myth, but it was directed in a completely different direction. Since the 1920s, there were processes of Ukrainization and indigenization when everyone was recorded as Ukrainians, Little Russians, Russians, Carpathian Russians, and Hungarians. And they were not just recorded, they were forced to learn the language, speak and write in it. With the arrival of the West in the 90s, this pressure only intensified. The system continued the work of the Bolsheviks.
Soros funds came in, started printing textbooks, started feeding us, as it were, yes, that is, teaching us and so on. And they conveyed information to millions through textbooks, through newspapers, through sects and so on. They simply had, that is, there was no resistance. That is, we were essentially defeated. We completely lost the war.
And it was not just a Cold War, it was a hot war. Why?
Well, because a lot of people died during the time when since we lost and were under Western control, we didn't reproduce, we were dying, getting sick, there was hunger, some kind of economic collapse and so on. And look at the statistics even for Ukraine. When Ukraine became independent, well, in the year 2000, 52 million people. We had a population of 52 million, I assume. Then by some year, like 2010, already 48. So millions of people died during this period just in Ukraine.
In Central Asia, this takes on an even harsher, barbaric character. Integration processes with Russia, both during the Empire and the Union period, are presented to the younger generation solely as genocide and bloody colonization.
Then comes a certain preacher who says that you need to participate in various activities or, in the spirit of African American struggle, receive compensation for years of oppression of you and your ancestors. But that's nonsense.
And yet no one has thrown out the Soros textbooks to this day. They are still in use both in Russia and in Central Asia. You can buy them and see for yourself. In Central Asia, children study from them, including in schools built with money from the Russian budget. And the maintenance of these schools is also funded by Russia. And all of this is presented as friendship and unbreakable cultural ties. Well, it's time for us to meet a new figure in our investigation. Meet the International Renaissance Foundation, the Ukrainian branch of George Soros's Open Society Foundations. It opened in Kyiv back in the distant year of 1990. From this moment until the year 2023 inclusive, the IRF invested over $350 million in supporting democracy, education, media, and civil society. Together with the National Endowment for Democracy, the structures the USA financed local NGOs, educational programs for politicians, media, non-governmental organizations, and later, finally, protest movements. And once again, the US government is involved, specifically the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. This is a body that coordinates and finances missionaries of various kinds around the world.
If you think that harmless sectarians cannot cause any harm, you are deeply mistaken and wrong.
The work of the Commission on Religious Freedom and its structures was organized systematically. They entered immediately and everywhere, sometimes supporting the revival of supposedly traditional beliefs, and sometimes imposing new cults, from Wahhabism to Pentecostalism, from pseudo-Christianity to neo-paganism.
The United States was declared the guarantor of religious freedom in all countries of the world. The principle is that this is a way to control other countries, exert pressure on them, and make them in one way or another make concessions to the United States. Well, for example, and again, this is not specifically directed against our country. This worked against any other country. When France passed laws against Scientologists, they were warned not to do so.
Support for religious and occult activities among youth and less educated believers was one of the important directions of the system's work, although they tried not to publicize this connection. The role of sects and their funding by Western organizations, including intelligence agencies, was hidden but could not be completely concealed. There were too many agents even outside the spiritual sphere.
Andrei Yermak, because his father was a resident of the Soviet Union's GRU in Afghanistan, graduated from the Institute of International Relations. His classmate was Mikhail Saakashvili.
By the way, Yermak was immediately in the loop, as they say, on these matters. Although, according to my information, for example, when Zelensky visited MI6, the very infamous one, they say Yermak, well, it's a tale. Maybe they told him Yermak was not allowed in. He said, I don't need Russian agents here.
Like many, let's say very cautiously, like the overwhelming majority up to a certain point until 2004 to 2014 for sure, Ukrainian elites were double and triple agents.
In 1959, a law called On the Captive Nations was passed in the United States. It lists all the peoples who, to some extent, found themselves in the territory of the USSR, in the countries of the socialist bloc, or simply under the influence of socialist and communist ideas. To be free, said the American curators, return to the faith of your fathers. Thus, the late 1980s and early 1990s saw a peak in the activity of endless preachers and occultists, those whom we would today call info-gypsies. This was especially evident in the so-called Ukraine with the rise to power of President Yushchenko, whose wife, as it happened, was a fervent sectarian and adherent of the American runic faith.
She was the daughter.
She was the daughter of such a person as Chumachenko, who was the second person in the first neo-pagan Slavic sect that emerged in the United States. It was founded by Lev Silenko, who wrote under the very tasteless pseudonym Lev Tigrovich Orligora. Silenko was once an officer in the SS Galicia Division, then fled to the United States, and in the 1960s he founded this very Runvira, native Ukrainian national faith in Chicago.
By the way, preachers and sectarians played a special role in the formation of the national battalions of the armed forces of Ukraine.
In the football community, this began to grow massively after Ukrainian SBU, specifically Nalivachenko, the head of SBU, deliberately started engaging with football fans around the year 2005 or 6.
By the way, his advisor at that time became the former Yarosh. Again, due to the lack of others, people with a Galician mentality were used. And there is no other Ukrainian essentially except for the myth of Soviet Ukraine, which is generally amorphous, loose, and unclear. And that Galician nationalism, a political myth, is very militaristic, and it is clearly tied to the activities of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and the SS Division Galicia.
For centuries, these swine called us Little Russians, trampled on our flag, mocked our language, and created a comical image of a Ukrainian with a top knot, lard, and dumplings. Something that for centuries slumbered in the depths of the Dnipro cliffs, a primordial and ancient Ukrainian god.
And now we are reaping our bloody harvest.
The seeds of the future system fell on fertile ground, and cultivating the former Soviet republics, those very ones where, in the mid-20th century, a huge number of revanchists, let's call them that, proliferated, as well as those who were dissatisfied with their lot, especially due to poor education. So, working with them was quite simple. In Russia, however, traditions turned out to be too strong, and overall the mentality is quite different. Therefore, heavy artillery was used. There is an apocryphal story for which there is no documentary evidence, but it is easy to believe in this story. It is just too logical.
As if Madeleine Albright.
This lady, during her time as US Secretary of State, met with Patriarch Alexei II during an official visit to Moscow. The agenda of the meeting was not disclosed, but church insiders claim Albright lobbied for the Commission's interests and persistently urged the Patriarch to respect the rights of all religious formations, even if these formations were the most cancerous.
As early as the beginning of the 20th century, the English used the Wahhabis, then only emerging in Saudi Arabia, against the Ottoman Empire, with which they were at war in the First World War. Then these ties strengthened. From around the late 1960s and early 70s, Britain began using radical Islamists against the Soviet Union. It is enough to remember that the late Osama bin Laden, the former terrorist number one, fought in Afghanistan. Through the English intelligence services, he actually studied. In England, he even supported London Arsenal. Since the 70s, headquarters of Islamist structures began to open in Britain. As of today, I have counted 84 of them. No city in the world has more headquarters of Islamist structures than London. Once again, 84 Islamist structures. All of them, and the British deep state, intend to use against their enemies, primarily against Russia.
The system is strong because it operates 360 on several fronts at once. She does not accept the practice of gradual movement. After all, it is that very swarm that works effectively. That is why so-called color revolutions flare up one after another across almost the entire territory of the former Union, organized according to a single manual and very often managed by a single headquarters of foreign technologists. The so-called Ukraine, the Orange Revolution of 2004. The USA allocates $65 million for it through the net, including for election monitoring. Freedom House and IRI trained volunteers conducted exit polls. Soros also invested in projects, $1,600,000 as a one-time contribution, and then $63 million annually for several years, both before and after the First Maidan.
In 2004, it suddenly dawned on me, why is there such a number of NGOs? And this realization came at the moment when, in just a miserable 1.5 to 2 hours, lined up tents appeared on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, appeared field kitchens appeared, centurions, decurions, and when all this suddenly became BAM, and immediately, wonderfully, amazingly organized. Who was doing this, I'll tell you. It was done by the so-called philatelists, beekeepers, I don't know, gardeners and others, those very ones. What's the idea? It's that for a small amount of money, you identify leaders. Small, big, medium, it doesn't matter. but you have a setup where they can organize for you at the snap of a finger. This one 5 people, this one 7, this one 80, and this one 1,500. And did we have these people there? We did not have them.
It was December 2004. We arrived in Kiev. Of course, we couldn't miss visiting Maidan. I'll be honest, I didn't feel any joy or success at that time. They said that they were being deliberately challenged, deliberately set against each other, paid for it. But as they say, the choice of the country was the choice of the country.
Western non-governmental organizations played the leading role in these processes, but organizations like PORA or the Center for Political and Legal Reforms not only developed strategies and engaged in brainwashing the population, but also actively trained militants, those who are capable of going all the way. In the role of instructors were specialists from Serbia.
The Serbs were the first serial project of subsequent color revolutions. They were tested in a very specific way at that time. They were experimental mechanics for an already industrial, rapid mechanism of regime change.
Later, similar schemes will be used at the Maidan in Kyiv. Meanwhile, students across the former Union are being trained in street protest tactics, branding of actions, and creating network communities. Endless concerts and parties are held, actively involving young people in the movement without a clear political agenda at that moment. Just hang out. Everything will be
not to mention attempts to organize their own Maidan in Russia.
The well-known Ilya Yashin, now an exiled extremist, but then still a very young street politician, in the spring of 2005, creates the coalition youth movement Oborona in Moscow, whose emblem, a raised clenched fist, seems familiar to the whole world, from the Middle East to Serbia, from Kyiv to Tbilisi. This part of the network structure was also fully funded from the United States with the active mediation of the late Boris Nemtsov, whose favorite at the time was Yashin.
Their asset, which they had invested in for a long time and considered possible to reuse, was clearly being taken out. Why is this happening? If people like Yashin are ready to come to terms with their inferiority and, by betraying the interests of the entire nation and country, get some personal jar of jam and basket of cookies like the bad boy, right? Then accordingly, for many hundreds of thousands, millions of our guys, this is fundamentally unacceptable accordingly. And such an exchange indicates that the West has to reuse spent material because, so to speak, it is not yet possible for them to cultivate new national traitors in our environment.
They actually don't have the goal to make a revolution in Russia, no. Their goal is to create an absolutely controlled society. They did some attempts to destabilize our society in 2005. Very interesting, if you remember, it was an attempt at pension reform and to replace benefits with payments. And it seemed like the pensioners came out, but behind these pensioners stood very specific agents of influence. And they were not of retirement age. And in 2011 to 2012, the protest actions, I think it was called the Snow Revolution. This is exactly Bolotnaya. It was already fully funded and sponsored by Western institutions.
Moldova stands apart.
The process of collapse here started as powerfully and rapidly as in other post-Soviet republics. However, local opposition members, unlike the Balts, Ukrainians, or Central Asian politicians, seemed unprepared for potential independence, and therefore were almost immediately forced to admit their goal was to join neighboring Romania. It looked extremely absurd if only because Moldovan statehood appeared earlier than Romanian. The language, although similar, was originally different, retained the original Cyrillic script, and was not subjected to Latinization.
Work in the Republic was immediately organized on a grand scale. The American embassy is open and ready to cooperate with anyone who, in diplomatic terms, sincerely shares Western values.
You just need to quickly register a non-governmental organization and you are immediately given a small grant, right? Initially a microscopic one, like $10,000. Then the grant becomes a bit larger, 20,000, then even larger, right, 50, then 100,000, then 200,000. And then your budget quietly reaches $1, $2, or even $5, $6 million, like we have, like some NGOs in the Republic of Moldova, such as, I don't know, Center for Increasing Resources, for example, which has almost $2 million, or Promolex, yes, which has 43 million lei, that is almost $2.5 million there, or Center Pass. In Moldovan, it translates to Centru de Politici and Analiza Notat. Yes, Center for Analysis and Policies in Healthcare. There, the budget is $5 to $6 million. You understand? So these are enormous budgets, right? And as a result, you see, you receive these budgets. The budget is given to you for a specific program, for a specific goal, a specific deadline. And of course, you have to report on this program, right? Well, for example, promoting the rights of the LGBT community, for instance, right? Combating racist propaganda. Fact-checking, right? It means you have to fight against lies, against fakes from the opposition, from disinformation. By disinformation, it means everything that the US Embassy doesn't like, everything that the current head of Moldova, Maia Sandu, doesn't like, and so on.
The scheme turned out to be so effective that it is still used today, more than 30 years later. To this day, key positions in Moldova are held by graduates of Soros programs, the pioneers of the so-called NGO-cracy.
The director of programs at the Soros Foundation, yes, Alesis Stamati, became the Minister of Justice. You see, under his wise leadership, an amnesty law was adopted, as a result of which several dozen killers, you understand, were released. Another director of the Soros Foundation programs became the director of the Information Security Service, which is the equivalent of Russia's FSB, the highly respected Mr. Nustiatsi, right? So 2/3 of the government have become classic Soros supporters, right?
But even with such total control over the country for 3 decades, the process of Romanianization is not going as smoothly as one would like. And already in the 90s, it yields the opposite result, first leading to the Transnistrian conflict and later initiating centrifugal processes in Gagauzia, which eventually resulted in the trial of the head of the autonomy, Evgenia Gutsul, and a sentence of 7 years in prison.
There is an evidence base, there is no evidence base, any facts or at least something similar. No, we believe so, that is the proof. A striking example, of course, is Evgenia Gutsul. And notice the term, it's not even a suspended sentence.
Such a fight against dissent also costs a lot of money. According to some estimates, the Hungarian philanthropist alone spent $129 million in Moldova. With this money, a media network was created. NGOs began promoting standard narratives, ecology, women's rights, LGBT, conducting seminars and trainings. USAID was not lagging behind, with its structures investing over $600 million in the country over 30 years, gaining control over entire sectors of politics, economy, and civil society.
Our civil society is considered more developed than in Serbia, than in Hungary, than in Montenegro, than in many European countries.
Nevertheless, despite having 14,000 NGOs, 85,000 volunteers, right? The budget of these NGOs, the combined budget of these NGOs in 2018, even in 2017, was 108 million euros. That was then 8 years ago. Today, you double it, right?
Moreover, these NGOs, as I told you, have infiltrated everywhere despite the fact that they are, knock on wood, everywhere. They are in the prosecutor's office, in the security and intelligence service, in ministries, in parliament, and so on. Moldova is the poorest country in the European Union. Moldova was recognized by the organization Freedom House as having for 20 years in a row a hybrid regime that is semi-authoritarian.
Moreover, Moldova was recognized by some organizations, well, like the Heritage Foundation for 15 years in a row, as not having a market economy, that we have a repressive economy, right? Furthermore, some organizations, yes, rated Moldova as having the most corrupt judicial system in the world.
The scheme, speak not for, but against, proved itself quite well in the Baltics, if only because Latvia and Estonia practically had no experience of their own statehood, and Lithuania could boast of it only in a historical context. However, there were more than enough genuinely unfounded claims against Russians. The descendants of Latvian riflemen seriously believed that they had been discriminated against throughout the years of being in the USSR, and therefore it was time to say a firm no to the colonizer. However, it is difficult to argue with the facts. All three republics were in a privileged position within the Union. The highest standard of living, the largest subsidies from Moscow, national personnel practically fully managed the regions, were part of the Politburo of the Central Committee, and held significant positions at the Union level.
From deeply agrarian countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia turned into well-developed industrial countries. Billions were invested there. It was the showcase of the Soviet Union. Everything went there, all the best, to the detriment in general of the other territories. We remember, well, even if we recall the earliest history, the day of the creation of the Cheka, 80% of the meetings were conducted in Lithuanian.
Well, later documents were declassified after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that directly the CIA picking up all these migrants. And we remember that in the year 1944, all of them or their children left with the Wehrmacht from the advance of the Red Army, were then taken under the wing by the CIA and essentially nurtured.
The Soviet Union's policy towards the Baltics over the decades gives the impression that they were simply overindulged, frankly speaking. This Soviet showcase created the impression among people that they didn't have to answer for the Holocaust, like in Estonia, for example, for Judenfrei, the only state, the only territorial entity during the Second World War that received the status of Judenfrei. That is, a territory completely freed from the periphery. Moreover, the Germans themselves admit this was mainly done by the Estonians. This was done by the Estonians. And did anyone bring this up during the Soviet years? No, it was not mentioned. And as a result, those overindulged Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian guys constantly felt oppressed, precisely because the Soviet Union treated them and kind of pampered them.
In the late 1980s, ultra-nationalist popular fronts became extremely popular, which began to operate on a network principle. The Balts traveled to the national republics of the Union, helping to create franchises locally. Congresses of Union opposition members were held in Vilnius. Leaflets and banned newspapers were printed here, which the local security officers lazily hunted for. In the Baltics, dealing with the KGB was particularly complicated. Western emissaries knew this and skillfully exploited it.
The same thing happened in Poland. Remember Lech Walesa? He, in the end, even recently stopped denying that he worked for, essentially, the Polish counterintelligence. The Polish counterintelligence believed that by using him as an agent, they could channel this wave of social discontent and the desire to change the political system in the direction they wanted. All counter, and they were wrong. They couldn't control it at a certain point. They lost that control.
Orange technologies turned out to be relevant here too, on the shores of the Baltic. These were the so-called singing revolutions. They were a response to a series of minor armed provocations, during which less than 30 people died in total. However, these were the very sacred victims. The technology was effective and it was systematically used later throughout the Union and beyond.
Their own were shooting at their own. Some bodies were being brought in from the roofs of those 5-story buildings. It was all being exaggerated. This was being declared on television. There were British instructors, there were CIA employees. There is still no answer as to where. Who are these 10 SAS people who arrived in Warsaw and who came to Lithuania? Who are they? What is this? No one says anything about this. Before that, for 3 days in a row, the radio was telling what to do if Russian tanks came in. If you don't have kerosene or food, stock up on flashlights. People were transported to this demonstration in an organized manner by buses. That is, of course, this is widespread, with the knowledge not just of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union of Lithuania and the KGB of the Lithuanian Republic, but also of the central apparatus. What we are saying is that a color revolution cannot be carried out without the top leadership of the intelligence services, the Ministry of Defense, and some kind of top party leadership.
By the way, discussions about who actually organized these provocations continue even today. But if there is no blood, it is even easier to find those interested. The books by American scholar Gene Sharp, From Dictatorship to Democracy, and the 98 Methods of Nonviolent Action are practically textbooks that the technologists of color revolutions know by heart.
With the help of these 2 books, he tried, in principle, to systematize his theory, which is that society remains consolidated, as it were, stability not only through the violence of the state over people, but also through the consent to obey. And the destruction of this system, non-violent protest, this is boycotting, this is strikes, that is everything that makes the functioning of the state system untenable, because in any case, the state is built on society, which is its absolute main tools, mechanisms that allow the state to exist.
As soon as these mechanisms stop functioning adequately, the system collapses.
If nonviolent protest does not work, the system moves to Plan B. Example, the sacred sacrifice scenario at Euromaidan in Kiev. Georgian mercenary snipers shoot protesters, and trained propagandists immediately create a new national myth, the Heavenly Hundred.
The funny thing is what? Already in the same year 2014, information began to appear that trees were being cut down there on Hrushevsky Street because bullets. So that the ballistics examination, well, external ballistics, yes, that's what happens with a bullet when it flies out of the barrel. The bullet trajectory indicated that they were fired at the Heavenly Hundred, yes, from the hotel, I think Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, which was controlled by the Maidan supporters. So they were shooting their own, while Berkut was in another place with Alpha, and they cut down these trees.
Everyone clearly understood what they cut down. Later, I think in the year 2015, early 2015, videos started appearing with Georgian snipers from the hotel. It all came together that the Heavenly Hundred were killed by the Maidan supporters themselves with the coup. And what, did someone go out to Maidan? Did Ukrainians come out? What? You deceived us, damn it. Like Scriabin's song, yes, he sang that they fooled us, tricked us like fools behind our backs. That's it. And what? Did someone come out? Let's roll everything back. Did we overthrow Yanukovych for nothing?
It turns out he didn't shoot the Heavenly Hundred. You shot the Heavenly Hundred yourselves, right?
No. Did someone come out? This is, what is it, damn, the revolution of dignity, right?
Revolution of dignity, worthy people.
For the truth, so what? You all know that this is how it happened. So did anyone come out and say no? Why? No one is organizing it, no one is paying, providing, or taking away. Okay, well, it wasn't those who shot. Alright. Over there in Donbass, children are being killed, they are shooting themselves. Well, okay.
There aren't very many residents in the Baltics. The option of massacres and truly bloody pogroms like in Central Asia won't work here. Plus, the image of true Europeans gets in the way.
Because there is a methodological similarity with the events in the so-called Ukraine, but everything is happening extremely peacefully.
For example, in Latvia, during the wave of perestroika, emissaries of the World Association of Free Latvians appeared, an international structure that included ethnic Latvians, many of whom not only lived in the West, but were also born there, held significant positions in their countries of residence, yet could easily not know their native language. By the way, this association openly declared its main goal in the 70s, an independent Latvia. And after the Declaration of Independence, it participated in the establishment of statehood, the formation of the cabinet, and the drafting of laws. It seems similar to a lot, doesn't it?
Even before the fall of Soviet power, the Latvian People's Front bureaus began to officially open in Europe, with Moscow's silent consent. And in 1992, Soros appears here, and his people launch programs that will effectively lead to national bankruptcy and the loss of financial sovereignty.
If we remember the 90s, it was again the transit of raw materials, semi-legal, again Russian and earnings. At the same time, maintaining a completely unfriendly ideology towards us. Well, because we allowed it. Why not use it? And as time goes on, it becomes clear that it's all complicated. If, for example, Lithuania loses a third of its population in a year of independence, meaning it has disappeared somewhere, a decrease in the number, a decrease in population by a third. How to explain this? Well, you can't explain it with Soviet repressions or with Stalin. No, you can explain it. They say, no, you can explain it. It's all because back then Stalin and now the Russians are plotting against us. Well, because otherwise you have to explain that you couldn't do anything here. You failed everything. Moreover, economic viability is also not working out. And what can you earn from...
You can make money on Russophobia.
And of course, how could it be without the Nazis? The ultra-nationalist Perkonkurs become the militant vanguard. Their emblem is a thunder cross, almost like a swastika. The Latvian anti-everything, Semitic, German, Slavic political party was founded even before the Great Patriotic War. The cross activists participated in the Holocaust, fought in the ranks of the Wehrmacht and the SS. The party was revived in 1991, and 5 years later it was ceremoniously dissolved. Having such a thing in the official political scene in those years was not quite respectable yet.
Well, probably a gradual feeling of strength because it was unclear again what would happen to them if they suddenly said something about it. You have to quietly shout about it somewhere, like how we often launch some informational topic, somewhere suddenly someone says something about it, watched how they react. Oh, they stayed silent, so you can shout twice, raise your hand. Again, they stayed silent, so it means you can shout 3 times. Well, unfortunately, again, my personal opinion is that in everything happening, unfortunately, we as Russia are to blame. But again, we were problematic at that moment, the 90s, the problematic early 2000s.
We needed to focus on internal affairs. I was born in Dnipropetrovsk, although my family is completely Russian. We were suddenly told that on the 1st of September we had to come in embroidered shirts, and this was in the Russian city of Dnipropetrovsk, where there were a large number of Russian schools, Russian engineers.
Everything very slowly, gradually, like the translation of all films into... Also suddenly 60% of films started appearing in Ukrainian, although before that they were in Russian in cinemas. Strategic planning, they didn't do it abruptly, they gradually implemented it. Oops, Russia didn't react.
Okay, so we will implement this. Oh, Russia is not offended. So, well, okay, then we can have torchlight processions.
By the way, the founder of the Nazi Perkonkurs surfaced in one of the leading positions in the CIA after 1945, and his friend and associate ended up at Radio Liberty. Today it is hard to believe, but back in 1989 it was declared that Lithuania joined the USSR illegally, based on which the still Union Republic declared its independence. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR at a meeting in Moscow confirms and recognizes this fact. This time they managed the collapse of their own country truly without the help of the West.
For some reason, everyone thinks that open sources are not enough for conducting an investigation. But not long ago, the Pentagon, of all places, the Pentagon, what useful or pleasant thing could it declassify? But suddenly they published a report from 1992 stating that it is important to prevent the emergence of a geopolitical rival to the United States in the post-Soviet space. That is, the United States must be the #1 hegemon. This is the postulate of this very report. In the so-called Wolfowitz doctrine, It is directly stated, "Our main goal is to prevent the emergence of a new rival, whether in the territory of the former Soviet Union, the Union or anywhere else." Once again, there should be only one hegemon. Comments here seem unnecessary, but there are other, no less important facts that confirm the existence of a single coordination center, which we precisely call the system. This is also the official acknowledgement by Victoria Nuland that the United States spent, think about it, $5 billion on the last Maidan. Yes, undoubtedly, compared to the amounts that the United States and Europe spend on supporting the armed forces of Ukraine, this seems, well, like a pittance. But this is entirely self-serving work, and they also invested in work in Russia, for example, in the activities of International Monetary Fund officials. Cunning businessmen invested money from the US Treasury into the privatization of Russian enterprises, planning to receive dividends into personal accounts. There are many other examples, from the development of the organ market and surrogate motherhood to the support of international terrorism, and we will deal with each of these facts during our investigation, which is just beginning.